Hey guys, tonight we ease into the dim light of a flickering oil lamp, the smoke curling lazily against mud brick walls, while outside a river swells and threatens its banks. You're standing barefoot in soft, wet earth, toes sinking into clay. That sticks to your skin like glue. The air is thick with the smell of water plants and animal dung, and somewhere in the distance a cow moans. This is Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, where history insists humanity first traded in its wandering. Nomadic life for the risky promise of staying put. You can almost hear the grumble of a farmer deciding, with a weary shrug, that planting barley and hoping the floods don't wipe him out might be better than chasing gazelles across endless scrubland. But let's be real, you probably wouldn't survive a single season out here. Between the heat, the floods, and neighbors who might not be too thrilled you've set up camp near their fishing spot. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and the time you're listening down in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The world around you is nothing but damp reeds, buzzing insects, and river mist curling over low, fertile plains. You trudge forward, feeling the squelch beneath your feet as small clusters of huts rise from the mud, like half-finished sand castles. These are not yet cities, not the bustling metropolises you'll come to know later, but they are villages, and their very existence marks a shift in human fate. Here, families no longer roam. Instead, they gamble on the river's bounty, planting wheat, barley, and lentils, then holding their breath to see if nature is kind. Historians still argue whether these first settlements emerged out of bold human planning or sheer necessity, maybe driven by overhunting, maybe by climate change, or maybe just by the irresistible pull of rich alluvial soil. Either way, you notice how quickly the experiment gets complicated. Farming means harvests. Harvests mean surpluses, and surpluses mean, sooner or later, someone is going to ask, who's keeping track of all this grain? It's almost funny how the act of planting a few seeds spirals into something bureaucratic. You see families trying to decide whose clay pot holds how many handfuls of barley. Without paperwork, disputes get messy. One person swears he gave his neighbor 3 baskets of grain. The neighbor swears it was only 2. And suddenly the community finds itself squabbling like children over candy. Quirky as it sounds, some scholars believe these squabbles may have fueled the need for a system, one that wouldn't rely solely on memory or trust. At the same time, temples start to poke above the flat horizon, small mud brick platforms that hint at both worship and authority. Farmers trudge toward them with offerings, not because anyone particularly enjoys parting with their hard-earned lentils, but because some collective trust or fear tells them to. Already, you sense the beginnings of a pattern. If food flows into a central place, someone has to count it, guard it, and maybe skim a little off the top. And here's a fact that should make you raise an eyebrow. While we tend to romanticize early farming as noble and idyllic, archaeologists often find skeletons of these villagers with spines worn down, teeth cracked from grit in stone-ground flour, and knees destroyed by repetitive labor. The shift from foraging to farming may have fueled civilization, but for the average Mesopotamian peasant, it was about as comfortable as sleeping on a rock mattress. You rub your lower back just imagining it. Yet, as the villages expand, something else happens. You begin to notice coordination. Digging irrigation ditches requires dozens of hands. Planting in neat rows demands timing. Protecting harvests from floods or raiders means guards, schedules, and collective effort. Slowly, you realize you're not just walking through fields, you're walking into a system, one where human lives mesh together in patterns that demand oversight. That's the seed of bureaucracy. Of course, some things remain hilariously improvised. One quirky tidbit: there's evidence that farmers smeared crocodile dung, mixed with mud onto their skin, thinking it would protect them from the brutal sun. Imagine the smell. You pass a man waddling out of the reeds with a greenish-brown coating slathered over his shoulders, and you politely hold your breath. Practical sunscreen? Maybe. Effective? Doubtful. Historians still argue whether it was ritual, medicine, or just a very misguided attempt at SPF 1. As night creeps in, you picture the villagers huddling inside their reed huts, the air humming, with crickets and the occasional plop of a frog in the irrigation ditch. They talk in hushed voices about water, about barley, about whether the rivers will rise to high this year. The land between rivers gives, but it also takes away, and the uncertainty gnaws at every conversation. You're lulled by the rhythm of it all. Plant, harvest, argue, offer thanks, repeat. You lie down in the dirt, staring at the faint glimmer of stars overhead, knowing this fragile experiment in farming will spiral into something unimaginably complex. The muddy huts will grow into walled cities, the grumbling farmers into subjects, the scribbled arguments into official records, and through it all, the quiet birth of bureaucracy pulses like a faint drumbeat beneath the soil. The sun rises over the flat plain, and you blink against the glare as the landscape turns gold. Farmers shuffle toward the fields, bent under baskets, their sandals slapping against dusty paths. The river air smells faintly of fish and wet reeds, but your attention is drawn to something less picturesque, the towering heaps of harvested grain, piling up near each family's hut. What once seemed like a blessing, more food than you could eat in a single meal, now looks like a logistical nightmare. You feel the same way you do when you leave laundry too long and suddenly the pile has become a small mountain, except here. It's barley, and leaving it uncounted risks famine, theft, or awkward neighborly disputes. You watch families glance nervously at their stores. If one household has a surplus, another might demand a loan. If a family's crop fails, someone else might accuse them of hoarding. And since everyone remembers what they're owed just a little differently, the air gets thick with suspicion. Historians still argue whether the first bureaucratic impulses were about generosity, sharing food in times of need, or suspicion, born from a constant fear that your neighbor was shorting you. Either way, a ledger of some kind becomes necessary. You notice how they start to improvise. Pebbles get counted out, one for each jar of grain. A family marks tallies on a clay wall with smudges of ash. A child is told to memorize exactly how many baskets were carried to the temple last harvest. But memory falters, pebbles roll away, and clay walls crumble in the rain. You sense their frustration, like a parent who realizes keeping receipts really is important after all. The temples loom larger now. They're not just places to mutter prayers, they've become de facto storage facilities. Farmers lug sacks of barley up ramps, squinting as priests stand nearby with that unmistakable air of authority. Leave it here, and the gods will bless your next crop, the priests insist. But everyone knows what's really happening. Those heaps are being centralized, guarded, and most importantly counted. This is the beginning of what you might call organized surplus management, or, in more familiar terms, the dawn of bureaucratic headaches. It doesn't take long for human quirks to creep in. A particularly stingy farmer tries to forget a few baskets at home. A priest quietly borrows a jar for his family. Complaints rise. The community realizes they need more than trust, they need a system that makes sure every basket is accounted for. And suddenly, the notion of bureaucracy doesn't sound so boring. It's survival. Here's a fact that surprises you. Archaeologists have uncovered vast storage facilities. From Mesopotamian cities, some with enough capacity to hold thousands of bushels of grain. Imagine walking into a cavernous mud brick hall, sunlight streaming through reed mats, the air thick with dust as men stack sack upon sack in neat rows. Each pile is tagged with some rudimentary marker, an early attempt at inventory management. If you squint, it's not much different from the backroom of a giant grocery store today, minus the forklifts. Quirky detail. Among these piles, rodents thrive. Cats slink between jars, tails twitching. Silently recruited as accidental staff in the world's first pest control department. You grin, realizing humans and cats probably struck their cozy alliance. Here, bonded over a shared hatred of mice raiding the pantry. One could argue bureaucracy didn't just create clerks, it created house cats. You also notice how the act of storage changes relationships. Food becomes less personal and more communal. Farmers start measuring wealth not in what they can carry, but in what the temple scribe says. Theirs. And of course, disputes erupt. That's my grain in the third pile. One man insists. Another replies, no, I delivered twice as much last month, without proof. Every argument risks turning violent, and so the community inches closer to developing standardized accounting methods. They experiment with clay tokens, tiny shapes molded from mud, each representing a goat, a jar of oil, or a sack of barley. These tokens can be sealed in clay envelopes, rattled like prehistoric piggy banks, and opened only by officials. Historians still argue whether this practice began purely as record keeping, or whether it carried a ritual function symbolizing cosmic order. Either way, it's clear that bureaucracy begins not with grand ideas but with small, practical tokens in the palm of your hand. Standing there, you realize that bureaucracy is simply the price of abundance. When life was about hunting and foraging, nobody needed ledgers. You ate what you caught. But once harvests piled up, you needed rules, counters, and watchful eyes. Surplus gave humans security, but it also chained them to accounting. And as you watch the priests jot marks in the dirt, cats chasing mice between sacks, and farmers arguing about who owes what, you can't help but laugh. Civilization didn't grow out of lofty ideals. It grew out of a very human problem, the hassle of too much stuff. You feel the weight of it pressing down, like the dusty smell of barley in a closed storeroom. Already, the river's gift of fertile land has birthed something bigger than any one farmer, the need for structure, oversight, and someone, whether priest, scribe, or future bureaucrat, to keep the numbers straight. You trudge across the clay yard, where the heat is already shimmering off the ground, and notice something curious in the dirt. Scattered here and there are little lumps of hardened clay, each molded into a shape: cones, spheres, discs, and cylinders no bigger than your thumb. At first glance, they look like the ancient equivalent of your kid's lost marbles, but as you stoop to pick one up, you realize these are the ancestors of bureaucracy, clay tokens, each one representing something from daily life, maybe a jar of oil, a sheep, or a basket of grain. The idea is brilliantly simple. Instead of arguing endlessly about who brought what, you hand over a token: a cone for barley, a sphere for livestock, a disc for beer. Suddenly, the world is reduced to a pocket-sized collection of symbols, a portable bookkeeping kit. You can almost hear some clever farmer muttering, "Finally, proof that I gave you the goat." Historians still argue whether this innovation was purely practical, born from disputes and trade, or if it carried some ritual magic, with each token believed to hold the spirit of the item it represented. Either way, the effect is undeniable. People start trusting clay more than memory. You follow a group of men toward a small temple outbuilding where these tokens are being collected. They're sealed into hollow clay balls called bully, which are then stamped shut with personal seals. Picture it: a grown man rattling a little mud rattle, the contents clinking softly inside, before handing it over as evidence of his debts or contributions. The priest accepts it with a knowing nod, then presses his cylinder seal an engraved stone rolled across wet clay to mark ownership. And just like that, bureaucracy takes its first steps. Here's the mainstream fact that makes you pause. Thousands of these tokens have been found across Mesopotamia, some dating as far back as 8000 BCE, long before writing. They're proof that record-keeping predates literature, predates laws, maybe even predates kings. Bureaucracy, it seems, is older than story time. Then there's the quirky tidbit: some tokens are shaped so oddly like miniature pyramids or teardrops that archaeologists still scratch their heads trying to figure out what they represented. Did that teardrop mean one cow? Half a jar of beer? A promise you'll mow my reeds tomorrow? No one can say for sure. You imagine an ancient official sighing as he squints at the weirdly shaped lump in his palm, muttering, "What on earth did I mean by this one?" A frustration every office worker today can relate to when staring at an old spreadsheet. And because humans can't resist overcomplicating things, the tokens soon become more than just symbols. Some bully are broken open, and the tokens pressed against the outside before sealing, so you don't even have to crack it to see what's inside. Others are replaced entirely with marks on clay tablets, drawn versions of the token, scratched with a reed stylus. You sense the moment of transition when a clay ball stops being necessary and people start scratching symbols directly. From tokens, writing is only a small step away. But back in this moment, you're surrounded by men jingling little mud rattles, their seals dangling from cords like ID badges at a corporate office. Each seal is unique, a miniature work of art, carved with lions, gods, or geometric patterns. They're not just bureaucratic stamps, they're statements of identity, like ancient signatures or company logos. One man rolls his seal across a ball with a flourish, grinning smugly. You can tell he's the Mesopotamian equivalent of someone with a personalized email signature. And too many emojis, the process feels oddly familiar. You wait in line. You hand over your token. Someone checks the record. Someone else stamps approval. The whole affair is tedious but necessary. And you realize you're watching the birth of what will one day be the DMV. A timeless truth emerges. Bureaucracy is boring, but it works. Of course, problems crop up. What if a token is lost? What if a priest miscounts? What if someone sneaks a fake into the pile? Historians still argue whether counterfeit tokens existed, but the temptation must have been there. Imagine trying to pass off a badly made cone as a real grain token, the priest squinting at it with suspicion before tossing it aside. Fraud, it seems, is as old as the system meant to stop it. Night falls, and you find yourself lying near a pile of discarded bully shards, the fragments, crunching under your weight like broken pottery. You stare at the stars, aware that these humble lumps of clay are doing more than tracking goats. They're nudging humanity toward abstraction, teaching people to think in symbols, to trust marks in clay as much as they trust their eyes. From these tokens, entire civilizations will learn to record taxes, laws, and literature, all because someone wanted proof that they really did hand over that goat. The morning heat shimmers, and you drift toward the largest structure on the horizon, a temple rising like a mud brick mountain. From the flat plain, its stepped walls cast long shadows, and its base is surrounded by courtyards where oxen plod in circles, grinding grain into flour. You smell the mixture of incense and baked bread wafting through the air, a strangely cozy reminder that this place isn't just for prayer. It's a warehouse, an office, a bank, and a supermarket all rolled into one. The temple, you realize, is where bureaucracy begins to tighten its grip. You climb the rough ramp leading up to the entrance, feet sliding on baked mud, and step inside. The cool interior hums with activity. Farmers unload sacks of barley, clay jars of oil, and baskets of dates. Priests stand nearby, watching with stern faces as scribes press symbols into wet tablets. You notice that the offerings aren't all about divine generosity. They're tallied, measured, and stored in neat rows. The gods get their share, yes, but so do the people who run this place. Here's the historical fact that makes your jaw drop. Temples in Mesopotamia controlled vast amounts of land and resources, often more than any single king. They were not just spiritual centers, but economic powerhouses. Imagine a modern corporation, but instead of shareholders, it claimed divine authority. It's no wonder the temple administrators needed endless records. They were handling everything, from food distribution to labor contracts. And then there's the quirky tidbit. Some of these temples had specialized rooms for brewing beer. And, yes, that beer was also carefully rationed and logged. Workers could receive beer as wages, doled out in precise amounts measured by bureaucrats who treated to jars of ale with the same seriousness as modern accountants treat to million dollars. You can't help but picture a priest frowning over a tablet, muttering, "No, you are only authorized for 3 pints today, not 4. The temple buzzes like an ancient office building. Scribes crouch at low tables, reeds scratching against clay, their styluses clicking like typewriter keys. Assistants ferry messages across courtyards, panting in the heat like overworked interns. Farmers shuffle forward, sweaty and nervous, hoping the numbers written down match the offerings they swear they delivered. Every step you take echoes with a truth that feels both ancient and modern. Once you centralize resources, you need paperwork to prove fairness or at least the appearance of it. Historians still argue whether temples genuinely served the community, or whether they siphoned off resources for elite priests. On one hand, there's evidence of organized ration systems feeding workers during hard times. On the other, there are endless records of priests living well-fed while ordinary farmers strained under quotas. Was the temple a benevolent safety net or the world's first tax office? The debate lingers, but either way, you know the bureaucrats were busy. The walls around you are plastered with clay tablets drying in the sun. Each one contains marked wedge-shaped impressions that are slowly evolving into cuneiform writing. You run your fingers across one, tracing indentations that represent jars of sesame oil owed to the gods. You're touching the origins of literacy itself, and yet the purpose couldn't be less romantic. People didn't start writing poetry or epics first, they started writing inventory lists. Humanity's first great written achievement was basically accounting. And oh, the complaints you overhear. A farmer grumbles that his grain is lighter than when he handed it over. A priest retorts that the gods are entitled to a larger share. A worker mutters that his beer ration seems watered down. You can practically hear the world's first "Can I speak to your manager?" moment echoing in the temple courtyard. Night falls, and you step back outside, watching the torches flicker along the temple's upper terraces. You realize the building isn't just a shrine to the gods, it's a shrine to administration, a monumental filing cabinet looming over the city. And while the people bow to its religious aura, you know deep down that the true power here isn't divine thunderbolts. It's the scribes hunched over their clay tablets, tallying jars and loaves, line after line. You settle against a wall, eyelids heavy, and feel the hum of paperwork swirl around you like a lullaby. The temple is both sacred and suffocating, a place where faith meets bureaucracy, where devotion is tallied in barley, and where civilization finds itself shackled not by gods, but by clay records that never forget. You wake to the rhythmic thud of stones grinding against grain, the steady beat of daily life echoing across the temple courtyard. The smell of fresh bread wafts from clay ovens, and the sharp tang of fermented barley drifts from nearby vats. Your stomach grumbles, but here in Mesopotamia, food isn't just about eating, it's about accounting. Every crumb, every sip, every ration of beer has to be measured, logged, and doled out with a bureaucratic seriousness that would make your modern cafeteria lady blush. You shuffle closer and watch as workers line up, clay bowls in hand, waiting for their daily portions. Bureaucrats crouch at low tables, styluses poised over damp tablets, noting exactly who receives what. The distribution looks simple enough. One scoop of barley gruel, one piece of flatbread, one ladle of beer. But the details matter. A laborer digging canals might get an extra scoop. A temple singer receives less grain but more beer. You can almost hear someone whispering, "Don't mess this up, remember what happened last time they shorted the bricklayers." Here's the historical fact that keeps you staring. In some Mesopotamian city-states, daily rations of bread and beer weren't just casual handouts, they were standardized, regulated, and written down in meticulous records. Workers were paid, not in coins, but in food and drink, their survival tied directly to the temple or palace scribes. To be counted was to exist, to be forgotten on a ration list was to starve. And then comes the quirky tidbit. Beer wasn't just wages, it was safer to drink than water. Mesopotamians brewed a thick, porridge-like beer, drunk through straws to avoid the floating husks. Imagine a courtyard full of sweaty workers sipping brown sludge through reed straws, each one sighing with relief that they weren't stuck with plain river water, and the intestinal disasters it promised. Some records even list beer debt. Sign that, yes, people could overdraw their liquid paycheck. Humanity invented iOS for booze long before credit cards. Historians still argue whether these ration systems were fair. On one hand, there's evidence of consistency, everyone knew what they were entitled to, and the lists were checked daily. On the other, favoritism crept in. Higher status workers got better beer, while others were stuck with thinner brews. Was it justice, Or was it the ancient version of office politics at the lunch line? The jury's still out. The sound of styluses scratching clay fills the air. One scribe calls out a name, another notes the number of loaves. The workers grumble, shuffle forward, and eat while still sweating from the morning's labor. You can't help but chuckle at the timeless scene. It's essentially a punch card system, except the card is a clay tablet and the reward is a pint of foamy sludge. You wander further in, where the ovens glow red. Women knead dough in rhythm, dusting their arms with flour, while men hold jars of beer toward shaded cellars. Everything is routine, every action logged. Somewhere, a scribe carves a record, 62 loaves delivered, 20 jars brewed. The language is repetitive, but that's the point. Bureaucracy thrives on monotony. A young boy scurries past, balancing a loaf nearly as big as his head. He pauses to watch the scribes, curiosity flickering in his eyes. You sense his future. Years bent over clay, memorizing lists, translating human hunger into wedge-shaped marks. For him, food isn't just sustenance, it's destiny. By dusk, the courtyard quiets. Workers slouch home, bellies filled just enough to face another day. The smell of yeast lingers in the air, blending with smoke from the ovens. You lie back against a sack of grain, watching bats flutter in the twilight. And it dawns on you, the act of eating has been transformed into a bureaucratic ritual. Bread and beer aren't just consumed, they're tracked, allocated, and defined by the clay tablets that never sleep. And in this rhythm, scoop, sip, scratch, tally, you hear the heartbeat of bureaucracy itself. Not dramatic proclamations, not mighty kings, but the soft scratch of reeds against clay, ensuring every worker gets exactly 3 loaves and no more. The next morning, you wander into a shaded corner of the temple complex where the real magic of bureaucracy is happening. It isn't in the storehouses or the beer vats, it's here, where rows of reed mats are laid out, and young apprentices sit hunched with their knees pulled tight, eyes narrowed in concentration. This is the school for scribes, the training ground for those who will spend their lives scratching the flow of Mesopotamia onto clay tablets. You hear the faint tapping of reeds on clay, the sound of an entire civilization learning how to keep track of itself. The scene feels oddly familiar. One boy groans, his back stiff as he practices the same wedge-shaped mark over and over. Another mutters under his breath as his clay tablet cracks, forcing him to start again. An older instructor strolls between the rows, cane in hand, barking corrections with the weary tone of someone who's seen far too many sloppy lists of goats. You smirk, realizing you're essentially in the world's first classroom, and the subject is accounting. Here's the historical fact that grounds it. Cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script invented by the Mesopotamians, began as an administrative tool. The earliest surviving tablets aren't poems or myths, they're inventories of grain, lists of laborers and tallies of sheep. Writing itself was born not to inspire, but to organize. You can almost feel the anticlimax. Humanity's great. Leap forward. It was paperwork. Then comes the quirky tidbit. Many school tablets that archaeologists have uncovered are filled with practice lines. The ancient equivalent of "I will not talk" in class scrawled across a chalkboard. Some even have doodles, sketches of faces, animals, or crude jokes scribbled in the margins by bored students. You imagine a scribe-to-be sneaking a smiley face onto the corner of his ration list, just to survive the monotony. Historians still argue whether literacy was widespread or deliberately restricted to keep scribes in high demand. On one hand, evidence suggests only a small elite mastered cuneiform, giving them immense power. On the other, clay tablets have been found in private homes, suggesting at least some ordinary folks dabbled in reading. Either way, scribes occupied a strange space, both indispensable servants of kings and temples, and a closed club of nerds with their own secret code. You watch as a boy struggles with multiplication. Tables, yes, multiplication was already part of the curriculum. He mutters numbers under his breath, scraping careful marks for 5 times 6. Only to have the instructor rap his knuckles when he smudges the clay. You can almost hear his thoughts. Why couldn't I just herd goats like my brother? But the truth is, scribes lived better than most. They ate well, dressed decently, and avoided backbreaking labor in the fields. Sure, they endured endless lines of symbols, but at least they weren't knee-deep in muck. Chasing runaway pigs. In one corner, a group of older students practice real assignments, writing contracts, drafting temple receipts, even composing letters. One tablet details the transfer of a cow from one family to another. Another lists workers assigned to a canal project. You realize these students aren't learning abstract skills, they're training to fuel the machinery of daily life. And then there's the ritual of the cylinder seal. Each student eventually earns one, carved from stone and rolled across wet clay to mark documents. They treat them with pride, like ID badges or treasured fountain pens. A few even wear them around their necks, clinking softly as they bend over tablets. One boy twirls his absent-mindedly, the same way a modern kid might spin a fidget toy during math class. By afternoon, the heat is unbearable, but the scribes keep scratching away. Their fingers are stained with clay, their backs hunched, their faces sweaty. You imagine centuries later, archaeologists digging up these tablets and marveling at their significance. But to the students here, they're just homework, tedious, repetitive, and occasionally smudged when someone sneezes. As dusk settles, the instructor dismisses them with a weary wave. The boys stumble out, carrying their tablets like report cards, hoping their parents will appreciate the endless rows of neat wedge marks. You linger, staring at the clay surfaces drying in the evening air, each one a frozen moment of learning. They look dull, but they contain the seed of something extraordinary, a world where records outlive memory, where orders survive long after the speaker is gone, where bureaucracy becomes immortal. You lie back on the reed mat, listening to the echoes of reeds clicking against clay, and it dawns on you, bureaucracy didn't just need rules or temples. It needed people, scribes, to breathe life into marks, to turn surplus into sentences, to make society legible. And those weary students, grumbling through multiplication tables, are the unsung midwives of history. The next morning, you shuffle into the crowded streets of Uruk, a city that hums like a beehive in the desert heat. Mud brick walls rise around you, towering gates decorated with carvings of lions and bulls. The air smells of baked bread, sweat, and something vaguely sour, probably the beer stalls lining the alleys. Everywhere you turn, there's bustle, carts creaking under jars of oil, merchants yelling prices, donkeys braying impatiently as their handlers haggle over a few extra handfuls of barley. This is no sleepy village anymore. This is a city-state, and it thrives because bureaucracy keeps it from collapsing into chaos. Your eyes wander to the market square, where the beating heart of administration pulses in plain sight. Merchants pile up goods, wool, fish, copper tools, while scribes crouch nearby with their reed pens, recording every transaction. One man pays for a bundle of reeds, the scribe scratches a line. Another trades wool for fish, another scratch. It's the sound of civilization breathing through stylus marks. Without these ledgers, you realize the city would drown in arguments before noon. Here's a historical fact to anchor you. Uruk, often considered the first true city in human history, may have housed 50,000 people at its peak around 3000 BCE. That's more than the population of many medieval towns. To keep such a place functioning, feeding mouths, digging canals, managing trade required an army of scribes and officials. Bureaucracy wasn't an afterthought. It was the skeleton that kept the body standing. Then comes the quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found clay tablets from Uruk that record beer rations issued to workers by name. Imagine stumbling upon your own payslip 5,000 years later, immortalized in clay, 2 jars of beer to Enkidu, 1 jar to Gilgamesh. Yes, those names show up on administrative records, too. Heroes of epic tales also had to collect their daily brews like everyone else. You smirk at the thought, legendary figures waiting in line for their allotted barley mush. Historians still argue whether Uruk's explosive growth was fueled by temple authority, palace power, or simply trade. Did bureaucracy arise as a tool of priests, as a machine of kings, or as the invisible hand of merchants demanding accountability? Whatever the case, the effect is clear. The city ran on paperwork. You follow a merchant leading a donkey laden with jars. He pauses at a booth, where a clerk tallies the goods, then presses a seal into a wet tablet. The merchant sighs, wipes his brow, and moves on. It feels tedious, but you realize each tiny act accumulates into something monumental. The entire city functions not on faith alone, but on records on the guarantee that every jar, every loaf, every donkey is written. Down somewhere dot above the market, you notice the looming ziggurat at the temple rising in layers, commanding the skyline. It isn't just a house of gods, it's a ledger in stone, a reminder that administration is sacred. You hear the chatter of citizens debating water rights, grumbling about grain shortages, and arguing about prices, and you see scribes weaving through the crowd like busy bees, capturing it all. The city itself feels like a living file system. Roads channel traffic like the lines on a tablet. Courtyards act as inboxes, full of goods waiting to be processed. Even the guards at the gates resemble clerks, checking who comes and goes, stamping human beings into the record of the city. As you wander deeper, you stumble across something both familiar and absurd, a complaint tablet. Yes, people in Uruk actually filed complaints. One tablet preserved for thousands of years contains a rant from a customer furious at a merchant who sold him inferior copper. You imagine the scribe sighing as he etched the words, probably muttering, "Why am I wasting good clay on this?" It's proof that customer service disputes are as old as cities themselves. By sunset, the market slows. Merchants pack their goods, donkeys trudge home, and the scribes collect their tablets, stacking them neatly like folders in an office cabinet. You lean against a wall, the noise of the city fading into the hum of evening insects, and realize something striking. The lifeblood of Uruk isn't just trade or worship, it's trust. And that trust doesn't live in people's memories. It lives in clay. Without those ledgers, the city would unravel. With them, it thrives, buzzing with arguments, exchanges, and endless negotiations. You exhale, knowing that from the streets, the habit of record-keeping will spread, shaping empires yet to come, and all of it every loaf, every pint. Every donkey's bray flows through the quiet hands of bureaucrats. The city of Uruk grows quieter as the sun sets, but in the palace, the hum of bureaucracy doesn't stop. You slip through a tall doorway, ducking under a lintel carved with lions, and enter a hall where the king sits not with warriors but with scribes. His throne gleams under torchlight, yet his attention isn't on jewels or feasts, it's on the stack of clay tablets arrayed before him, like a wall of paperwork. For every royal decree, there's a scribe ready to carve it into permanence. You hear the scratch of reeds echo like an ancient typewriter. The king leans forward, voice booming as he issues orders. Soldiers must be supplied with grain for a campaign. Canals need repair before flood season. Taxes are to be collected from merchants arriving with caravans. Every word is caught by the scribes, who bend low, pressing symbols into clay that will outlast even the king himself. You realize with a wry smile that rulers in Mesopotamia didn't just need armies, they needed paperwork. A king could command 1,000 men, but without clerks to track rations, those men would starve before reaching the battlefield. Here's the historical fact. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, Mesopotamian kings were utterly dependent on scribes to extend their power. Royal inscriptions, tax records, even the earliest diplomacy all filtered through the hands of bureaucrats. The throne's strength wasn't in its wood or gold, but in the files stacked behind it. And then the quirky tidbit: archaeologists have uncovered tablets where kings micromanaged details that seem laughably small. One record from Lagash lists not only the assignment of oxen to ploughing teams, but also which ox had a limp. Imagine the king of an entire city-state obsessing over livestock health reports, like an emperor scrolling through HR complaints about a broken office chair. You can almost hear him sigh, "Fine, give the limping ox fewer hours." Historians still argue whether these decrees were truly enforced, or whether they were mostly symbolic, meant to project an image of order. Did the king actually care about a farmer's ox, or was the tablet more like ancient propaganda, saying, "Look how meticulous and fair I am"? Either way, The existence of the record shows how deeply bureaucracy seeped into our ulership.su. Wander through the palace, you notice shelves stacked with tablets, each encased in clay envelopes. They contain lists of taxes, names of conscripts, deliveries of timber, contracts for bricklayers. Each one has the king's authority pressed onto it with a cylinder seal, like a royal signature. But it's not the king's hand doing the pressing, it's the scribes. The irony strikes you. The ruler's power flows through the quiet scratches of men whose names history rarely remembers. A messenger bursts in, dusty from travel, carrying a tablet wrapped in cloth. He bows, presents it, and the king waves a scribe over to read it aloud. The words are stiff and formal, a governor reporting the harvest, pledging loyalty, requesting supplies. The room fills with murmurs and the king nods gravely as if pondering some great truth. But you can't help thinking it's basically the world's first quarterly report, full of the same dull details that put modern readers to sleep. And yet, it's this dullness that builds empires. You see it clearly, orders ripple outward, carried by couriers, copied onto tablets, checked by officials, and finally acted upon in muddy fields far from the palace walls. Without this paper, or rather, clay trail, royal commands would vanish in the hot wind. With it, the king's voice can reach across rivers, deserts, and generations. Night deepens, and the palace grows quiet. The king retires to his chambers. But the scribes remain, hunched over lamps, finishing tablets by flickering light. They sigh, stretch their aching backs, and stack the day's work neatly for storage. The waxy smoke of torches fills the air, and the scratching continues like a lullaby of authority. You lean against a column, eyelids heavy, and realize you've witnessed the real machinery of power. It isn't the king's roar or the soldiers' swords. It's the quiet persistence of bureaucrats turning words into clay, making ephemeral commands endure. Without them, the king's orders would dissolve like dust in the wind. The morning sun peeks over Uruk's walls, and you wander back into the market square. The air smells of donkey sweat, roasted fish, and freshly baked bread. Merchants are already shouting, hawking everything from wool to copper tools. But your attention is drawn not to the goods themselves, but to the tables where scribes sit with damp clay tablets, ready to turn everyday exchanges into permanent marks. And here, amid the bustle, you discover something both familiar and hilarious: receipts. Yes, the Mesopotamians invented the ancient version of the slip of paper you stuff into your wallet and forget about. You watch as a merchant leads forward a donkey, its ears flicking in irritation. A buyer inspects the animal, prodding its ribs, checking its teeth. They haggle, voices rising like crows. Finally, a price is agreed: so many jars of beer, so many sacks of barley. But the deal doesn't end there. The scribe steps in, pressing wedge-shaped notes into the clay. One donkey, brown, purchased for such and such payment. The buyer and seller nod solemnly as the scribe rolls a cylinder seal across the tablet's surface, stamping it with official authority. Congratulations, you've just witnessed the first DMV-worthy donkey paperwork. Here's the historical fact. Archaeologists have found thousands of such transactional tablets, recording sales of land, slaves, livestock, and food. They serve as contracts and receipts, binding both parties to the deal. Some even specify what happens if one side defaults. Forget oral promises here. Bureaucracy guarantees the donkey really changes hands. And then the quirky tidbit: some of these tablets record promises to deliver beer in the future. Imagine walking away from a deal where the fine print says, "Payment due, 10 jars of beer by harvest time." You grin at the thought of a merchant hounding his debtor months later. "Excuse me, where's my beer?" Debt collection, you realize, is as old as debt itself. Historians still argue whether everyone trusted these clay contracts equally. Were they ironclad guarantees, or were they only as strong as the officials enforcing them? Some believe the tablets carried divine weight, backed by temple authority. Others suggest they were more symbolic, a kind of social pressure that worked only because everyone believed they should. Either way, the act of writing something down gave it a permanence that oral agreements lacked. As the market day unfolds, you see contracts covering all sorts of oddities: A man sells a set of tools, carefully listed one by one, to axes 3, chisels 1 hammer. Another tablet records the sale of a house, specifying boundaries by landmarks from the big tamarisk tree to the canal bend. One especially amusing receipt notes the transfer of sheep, with the caveat that if the animals die within 10 days, the seller owes replacements. It's essentially a Mesopotamian return policy. You chuckle at the timelessness of it all. People wanted receipts 5,000 years ago for the same reason they want them now, to avoid getting ripped off. Imagine the relief of a buyer flashing his clay tablet when accused of stealing a donkey. Check the records I paid fair and square. The scribes, of course, wield enormous influence. Without them, no contractors wait. They sit in the middle of every deal, reeds poised like referees, ensuring the rules are followed. And in return, they carve themselves into the economy as necessary as merchants or farmers. You realize that bureaucracy isn't just hovering in the palace or temple, it's in the marketplace, shaping every transaction, no matter how small. By dusk, the scribes stack their clay contracts to dry, leaving rows of tablets hardening in the fading sun. The marketplace quiets, donkeys snort softly in their pens, and merchants count their jars of beer with satisfaction. You lean against a wall, watching the glow of torches flicker against drying clay, and feel the weight of it all. These receipts aren't just for donkeys or beer. They're seeds of something much bigger. The idea that agreements can outlast memory, that promises can be made concrete, that society itself can be glued together with paperwork. And though it might seem boring, now you sense the quiet revolution from this point onward. Nothing in life will ever escape the scribe's stylus. The market square has quieted, but not everyone is satisfied. You follow a man clutching a tablet, his face twisted in frustration. He storms toward the temple office, muttering curses under his breath about a missing shipment of barley. Inside, scribes look up warily, already bracing for another complaint. Welcome to the first recorded era of bureaucratic rants, the Mesopotamian customer service desk. He slams the tablet down. The scribe squints, reading the neat cuneiform, 10 sacks of grain promised. Only 8 delivered. The man waves his arms, wildly, shouting about fraud, lazy officials, and bribes. You stifle a laugh. It's basically a Yelp review in clay. The scribe sighs, dips his stylus again, and begins composing a formal record of the grievance. Even complaints must be immortalized. Here's the historical fact that grounds this. Mesopotamian archives include dozens of complaint letters. One of the most famous comes from a copper merchant named Enver, who infamously sold subpar ingots. A furious customer wrote to him demanding refunds and threatening to never do business again. Archaeologists unearthed the letter 1,000 years later, making it the oldest bad review in history. You can practically hear the exasperated tone. Your copper is terrible, and you lied about it. Some things, it seems, never change. And the quirky tidbit, a few complaint tablets include sarcastic jabs, like customers mocking officials for their incompetence. One tablet even accuses a bureaucrat of taking bribes in beer. Picture someone today writing, "The clerk only helped me after I bought him a 6-pack." The humor is timeless, baked into the clay. Historians still argue whether these complaints actually led to action. Did officials investigate? Were punishments handed out? Or were these just ritual grumbles, more symbolic than effective? Maybe. The act of writing the complaint was itself the satisfaction, like posting an angry review online, knowing at least someone will read it. You glance around the office. Piles of clay tablets lean against the walls, each one documenting a quarrel, missing donkeys, stolen tools, delayed shipments. The scribes treat them with the same gravity as royal decrees, stacking them neatly as though each petty squabble deserves eternity. It's bureaucracy's greatest strength and greatest weakness. Everything gets recorded, whether monumental or mundane. A man shuffles forward next, grumbling that his neighbor bribed a clerk to lower his tax. The scribe nods, scratches it down. Another insists the beer ration was watered. Another whispers that the official weights in the marketplace were tampered with. You realize quickly that corruption and complaints are the Siamese twins of bureaucracy. Wherever there are officials keeping records, there are also people bending the rules and others ranting about it. The air grows thick with frustration. Farmers argue in the doorway, waving their arms, shouting over one another. Clerks roll their eyes, whispering that nothing will come of this. You can practically feel the fatigue of officials drowning in grievances, each one demanding justice, and you realize with a shiver of recognition, bureaucrats invented not just records, but red tape. By evening, the office clears. The scribes stack the complaint tablets with the same care as tax records, tucking them onto shelves where they'll dry and sit for millennia. Outside, the complainers shuffle home, muttering, perhaps comforted that their anger has at least been immortalized in clay dot you sink against a pillow. Eyelids heavy, as torchlight flickers over the walls of tablets. The air smells of dust and oil, and the quiet hum of scribes still scratching in the background lulls you. You realize you've just witnessed the most ancient version of customer service. Endless arguments, endless paperwork, and no clear guarantee of resolution. And it's oddly comforting. Bureaucracy, after all, has always been less about fixing problems and more about documenting them. The next day, you wake to the clatter of sandals on stone and the low murmur of voices gathered in the courtyard. A line of weary clerks shuffles forward, each carrying stacks of tablets, their arms straining under the weight. Today isn't about collecting taxes or rationing beer. Today is audit day, the moment when bureaucracy turns inward and begins checking itself. You realize with a sigh that even in 2500 BCE, someone already invented the stress of year-end reviews. The officials sit cross-legged on reed mats, sunlight pouring down in shafts that illuminate clouds of dust. A senior scribe stern-faced, his beard perfectly combed, reads aloud the records one by one. Another cross-checks the numbers, comparing them against deliveries, receipts, and complaint tablets. It's painfully familiar. You're watching the first accountants, furrowing their brows and tallying sums, their sighs echoing across millennia. Here's the historical fact anchoring this scene: Mesopotamian temples and palaces routinely performed audits. Some surviving tablets show corrected figures, crossouts, or notations clearly made during reviews. Officials kept careful ledgers of grain and livestock, then double-checked them to prevent fraud or at least to catch it when it became obvious. The habit of balancing the books is as old as the books themselves. And a quirky tidbit: a few tablets contain notes scolding scribes for sloppy work, like your calculation is incorrect or do not repeat this mistake. Imagine having your boss's irritated comments baked into clay forever. You picture some poor apprentice grimacing as his math error becomes an artifact admired by archaeologists for 1,000 years later. Historians still argue whether these audits were genuinely rigorous or just ritual performances to show control. Did supervisors really punish corruption, or did they merely shuffle numbers until they looked respectable? Perhaps the truth lies in between. Some audits exposed fraud and led to consequences, while others served mainly to reassure kings and priests that everything was fine. You watch as a clerk trembles, presenting a tablet about a shipment of fish. The senior auditor frowns, cross-checks another record, and snaps at the clerk. Missing to baskets, explain. The man stammers about spoilage, about fish eaten by guards. The auditor scowls, makes a mark, and sets the tablet aside for further investigation. It's the Mesopotamian equivalent of getting flagged by the IRS. Nearby, another scribe explains a discrepancy in beer rations. The clay notes say 30 jars, but the storeroom shows only 28. The auditor glares, mutters something about lazy overseers, and writes a corrective note. You chuckle. Bureaucracy invented not just auditing, but passive-aggressive memos. The day stretches long, sweat drips from foreheads, clay dust coats hands, and tablets pile high. One auditor chews on a reed stalk as he listens, shaking his head with boredom. Another scribbles corrections so fast his stylus blurs. The air is thick with fatigue, but also with a strange energy, the knowledge that mistakes matter, that someone is always watching, and there are punishments. One unlucky clerk is dragged before the group, accused of falsifying figures. His tablet claims 50 sheep delivered, but witnesses insist only 40 arrived. The auditors scowl, mutter about dishonest behavior, and fine him a portion of his grain ration. Others whisper that harsher punishments exist: demotion, beatings, or exile from the temple staff. You wince, realizing even ancient bureaucrats lived in constant fear of audits docked by sunset. The tablets are stacked in neat piles, corrected and annotated. The senior scribe dismisses the clerks who slouch out, exhausted but relieved, the courtyard. Empties, leaving only the faint sound of night insects and the glow of clay drying under fading light. You lean back, eyelids heavy, and absorb the scene, the tedious yet vital act of checking, double-checking and correcting records, and you understand something essential. Bureaucracy isn't just about recording, it's about policing itself, creating loops of accountability that keep society running or at least give the illusion of order. From these audits, the very concept of official truth is born, stamped in clay and checked by weary scribes with aching backs. You rise the next morning to the clang of hammers echoing through the city, a sound that draws you toward the main square. At first you expect another warehouse or temple, but what looms ahead is different: a tall stone stele, freshly polished, standing like a sentinel in the sun. Around it, scribes chip away at inscriptions while guards keep curious citizens at bay. This is no ledger of barley or beer. It's something new law, carved into permanence. You realize with a shiver that bureaucracy has grown teeth. The stele towers above you, its top carved with divine imagery, a king receiving authority from a god, rays of power streaming down. Below, neat rows of wedge-shaped signs march across the surface. The words are rigid, unforgiving, etched forever into black stone. You lean closer, squinting at the symbols, and realize they describe rules. What happens if someone steals, if someone lies, if someone cheats on a deal? Where earlier tablets handled grain and donkeys, this one handles justice itself. Here's the historical fact that grounds you. The Mesopotamians pioneered written law codes long before Hammurabi's famous version. Fragments from Ur and Lagash detail regulations on property, wages, and punishments. By inscribing them in stone, rulers made the rules visible and inescapable. No longer could officials claim ignorance or twist the terms, at least, not without the risk of being caught. And here's the quirky tidbit: some early law codes spelled out oddly specific situations. One fragment dictates what happens if an ox gores someone's slave, versus goring someone's free citizen. Different fines, carefully noted. You smirk at the bureaucratic precision. Even for 1,000 years ago, people argued about liability clauses. Picture to men pointing at a wounded ox and shouting, "Check the stele." Whose problem is this? Historians still argue about the purpose of these codes. Were they genuinely enforced, creating fairness across society, or were they more symbolic? Public relations carved in stone, meant to show that the king was just and attentive. Some suggest they functioned like moral guidelines more than strict statutes, rarely consulted in daily disputes. Either way, the presence of the law shaped behavior, whispering into every citizen's ear, the king is watching and the rules are written down. You step aside as a group of farmers gather, squinting at the stele while a scribe reads the laws aloud. They nod solemnly, muttering to one another. For some, it brings relief, proof that bribes and favoritism can't entirely erase fairness. For others, it's another layer of control, another way for rulers to tighten their grip. Either way, the stone stands unmoving, its words indifferent. To opinion, the city buzzes with stories: a merchant fined for watering down beer, a builder punished for shoddy walls that collapsed in the rain, a thief forced to repay double what he stole. Whether exaggerated or not, the tales ripple outward, reinforcing the idea that the written word has authority. You wander closer to the workers chiseling the bottom rows. The tap of their tools rings sharp and steady, sparks glinting in the sun. You realize each stroke is not just craft but power, embedding the bureaucracy of law into rock itself. These carvers, like scribes, are the unseen backbone of authority. Without their steady hands, the rules would vanish like smoke dot as night falls. The stele looms black against the stars. Citizens drift away, whispers still circling about its new decrees. You settle on a stone nearby, eyelids heavy as the last. Rays of light trace the god's figure at the top, and it strikes you, law codes are simply bureaucracy at its sternest. An attempt to freeze justice in clay and stone, to give permanence to fairness or control, to remind everyone that the scribes' marks aren't just for bread and beer anymore. They now govern life itself. The stone still glimmers faintly in the dawn light as you drift back toward the heart of the city. But today you sense tension in the air, not from farmers grumbling about rations, not from merchants shouting about donkeys, but from something deeper, the clash between palace and temple. For centuries, the temple scribes have ruled the records, tallying grain, assigning rations, and even inscribing laws in stone. But now the kings, flushed with military victories and palatial wealth, want the clay tablets stacked in their own storerooms. You can almost hear the muttered question in every alley. Who should control the ink, or rather, the reeds? You pass the temple gates where priests in white robes shuffle forward. Clutching their own styluses, they frown as they watch palace officials march by in crisp tunics. Scrolls and seals dangling from cords. It's like two rival departments, eyeing one another across a corporate office, each convinced they're the ones keeping the lights on. And in a way, they're both right. Here's the historical fact. Mesopotamian city-states were often defined by this very tug-of-war. Temples commanded immense landholdings, labor forces, and stores of food. Palaces, on the other hand, commanded armies and boasted the charisma of kingship. Both depended on bureaucrats and both jealously guarded their archives. Some dynasties leaned priestly, others kingly, but all recognized that whoever held the tablets held the power. And the quirky tidbit? Archaeologists have found duplicate sets of records, one tablet stored in the temple, another in the palace. Imagine two offices keeping separate spreadsheets, each insisting their numbers are the real ones. You grin, picturing ancient scribes sighing as they recopied the same list of barley twice, muttering, "Why do they make me do this?" It's the earliest known example of bureaucratic redundancy. Historians still argue whether the temples genuinely resisted royal takeover or whether they slowly merged into palace administration. Some see sharp conflict, priests versus kings in a battle for control. Others suggest a smoother evolution, with temples gradually absorbed into centralized monarchies. The truth is probably somewhere in between, a messy dance of rivalry, compromise, and shared ledgers. You slip into the palace courtyard, where a king's scribe reads aloud a decree. Tax revenues will now be recorded, first in the royal hall, then passed to the temple. Priests mutter angrily, insisting the god's house should still stand at the center of accountability. The king's guards glare at them, hands on spears, reminding everyone whose authority glitters more dangerously. You feel the unease ripple. Like heat off stone dot as the day unfolds, you watch the subtle war of bureaucracy play out. A priest insists his tally of grain is higher than the palace's. A palace scribe accuses the temple of hoarding. A shipment of wool is claimed by both sides, each waving its own stamped tablet as proof. It's absurd, yet deadly serious. Behind the arguments, power shifts like sand in the wind. One priest corners you, whispering that the temple protects the city from famine, its records blessed by the gods. Minutes later, a palace clerk insists that only the king can ensure fairness. His records backed by soldiers rather than incense. Both sides seem convinced. Both scribes keep scratching. And you realize this is the essence of politics, not swords clashing but styluses. Each stroke a small battle on wet clay dot. By nightfall, you stand between the ziggurat glowing in torchlight and the palace silhouetted against the stars. Two giants loom over the city, both built of mud brick, both humming with records and rituals. Between them lies the fragile life of the people, farmers, traders, workers pulled back and forth by competing ledgers. You settle into the dust, eyelids heavy, listening to the echo of scribes scratching away in both temples and palaces. And you can't help but chuckle in the end. The gods and kings both need the same thing, someone to keep the receipts. The city wakes with its usual chorus, donkeys braying, pots clattering, and merchants shouting, but today you decide to leave the palace square behind. and wander through the narrow alleys where ordinary people live. The houses are small, built from sun-baked mud brick, their walls crumbling slightly at the corners. Smoke curls from ovens, children chase each other through puddles, and you notice that even here far from temples, and king's bureaucracy has quietly seeped into every corner of daily life. A farmer stands at his doorway, arguing with a tax collector. The man insists he already handed over 5 sacks of barley, but the collector shakes his head and points to a clay tablet. The marks are clear. Only 4 sacks were recorded. The farmer's wife mutters under her breath, but there's nothing they can do. The tablet holds more weight than memory. For this family, bureaucracy isn't an abstract system. It decides whether they eat well this month or tighten their belts. Here's the historical fact that roots the scene. Mesopotamian bureaucracy touched nearly every household. Taxes in kind grain, oil, animals were logged and enforced, and households were expected to contribute labor to irrigation projects or temple construction. Surviving tablets show names of commoners assigned to tasks, as if their lives were written into schedules they didn't choose. And then the quirky tidbit: some tablets actually record rations for prisoners of war or slaves, down to precise amounts of bread and beer. Imagine being captured, only to find your survival calculated in barley portions etched by a bored scribe. One record even includes the note, 1 extra loaf for the sick man. You grin at the humanity tucked inside the monotony. A bureaucrat, deciding compassion deserved its own entry. Historians still argue whether this level of control crushed the common people or protected them. Was bureaucracy a safety net ensuring no one starved, or a suffocating grip that left farmers barely surviving under quotas? Some argue it gave stability in harsh times. Others say it locked ordinary people into a cycle of endless obligations. The truth probably depends on which side of the stylus you stood. You walk past a workshop where a potter leans over his wheel. Beside him, a tablet lists his deliveries to the temple: 12 jugs, 3 cracked. The cracked ones are still counted proof that nothing escaped the bureaucratic eye. Across the lane, a weaver sits at her loom, sighing as she ties knots. Her records, too, are kept: rolls of wool, finished cloth, payments in beer. Bureaucracy doesn't just track goods in palaces. It infiltrates kitchens, looms, and workshops, marking lives with numbers dotted the edge of the street. A boy runs errands for his mother. He clutches a small token, clay-pressed with a seal, entitling him to collect their ration of oil. He hurries to the storehouse, hands over the token, and receives a jug. The scribe records it, scratches another tally, and waves him off. You watch him dart home proudly, clutching the oil as though he'd won treasure. He doesn't know it, but he's acting out bureaucracy's script. His family's life reduced to the faint grooves of a reed pen dot by dusk. The streets fill with chatter. Neighbors compare their tax burdens, traders grumble about permits, and workers joke bitterly about the endless lists. One man laughs that even his donkey seems more important than he is, because at least the animal has a record in the archives. Another mutters that the gods themselves must be clerks, since every misstep seems written down somewhere. You can almost hear the weary humor that keeps them going, sarcasm as survival in a world ruled by clay tablets. The sky darkens, the air cools, and families gather on their roofs to eat. Bread is passed around, beer is poured into reed straw cups, and children drift to sleep as adults murmur about tomorrow's quotas. You lie back on the flat roof, staring at stars dimmed by the smoke of cooking fires, and realize something humbling. Bureaucracy doesn't just belong to kings and priests. It runs through the veins of ordinary life, deciding who owes, who receives, and who gets remembered. In a world of fragile huts and fleeting harvests, the only permanence is clay. The streets of Earth slowly grow quieter, but you find yourself drawn toward a cluster of merchants gathered near the city gates. They're dusty, sunburnt, and clearly frustrated, sitting cross-legged with clay tablets balanced on their knees. As you get closer, you realize you've stumbled on another branch of Mesopotamian bureaucracy: private letters, scratched into clay and sent like ancient emails across the desert. The voices of weary traders echo in the dim torchlight, muttering about shipments, delays, And of course -donkeys. One merchant sighs as he dictates to a scribe, "To my brother in Sipper, why have you not sent the wool? The silver I paid has not returned value. If you delay further, I shall come myself." The scribe dutifully presses each wedge into the tablet, sealing the irritation into clay. The merchant frowns, then adds a postscript and send better copper this time. You smirk. This could easily be a modern text message. Where's my stuff? Don't mess it up again. Here's the historical fact anchoring this moment. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of such clay letters from Mesopotamia, often folded in clay envelopes and marked with seals. Merchants, families, and officials all relied on these missives to communicate across vast distances. They're not lofty epics but practical notes, full of complaints about shipments, instructions about loans, and reminders about deadlines. And then the quirky tidbit, some letters even include insults, like one trader accusing another of being lazy or dishonest. The tone is so biting you can practically hear the writer's exasperation. Imagine taking the time to insult someone on clay, knowing it could take weeks for the letter to arrive. One even jokes about sending a donkey that walks slower than an old man. Bureaucracy may be dry, but sarcasm survived the kiln. Historians still argue about how reliable these letters were in shaping trade. Did they always reach their recipients? Couriers had to travel across deserts, through hostile territories, often with only a donkey or camel. Some letters may never have arrived at all. Others may have been intercepted, cracked open like nosy neighbors rifling through your mail. Still, the sheer volume of correspondence shows how much merchants depended on this system of clay communae. You trail another merchant who unwraps a letter from home. His wife writes about the household, the children sick with fever, the barley ration too small, the servants grumbling. She urges him to return soon, or at least to send more silver. The man sighs deeply, rubbing his beard. You can almost see the weight of bureaucracy crushing him, not just taxes and audits, but the constant nagging flow of letters demanding responses. The scribes, of course, are essential. They read the letters aloud for illiterate merchants, then compose replies in neat rows of wedges. One man complains that the courier took too long. So the scribe carefully notes the grievance. Next time, send the donkey faster. The complaint, you realize, is not just vented, it's preserved for eternity, baked into clay dot by dusk. The merchants seal their letters with cylinder seals, rolling intricate designs over the envelopes. The torches flicker, shadows stretching. As the clay dries, couriers prepare to leave at dawn, bags of tablets slung over their shoulders, ready to tramp across endless miles of desert. You can almost hear the donkeys groaning in advance. You settle against a wall, eyelids heavy, and listen to the murmur of dictation still floating through the air. These clay letters aren't poetry or legend. They're bureaucracy distilled into personal form, the endless communication, the nagging, the checking, the blaming. And as you drift towards sleep, you realize that bureaucracy isn't faceless after all. It has voices, cranky, impatient, and human, grumbling across millennia, in wedge-shaped whispers. The dawn air is cool as you follow a caravan preparing to depart the gates of a donkey snort, wagging their tails, and handlers shout as they secure sacks of grain, copper ingots, and jars of oil. This isn't just trade within the city, it's diplomacy stretching far beyond the horizon, and of course, bureaucracy follows along like a shadow. Every treaty, every marriage alliance, every exchange of gifts between rulers must be written down, stamped, sealed, and double-checked. You trail the caravan, realizing you're watching the world's first foreign affairs office in action. In the courtyard just inside the gate, a messenger kneels before a group of scribes. They unfurl tablets that detail his mission, which king he serves, what goods he must deliver, the precise wording of greetings he must recite. He repeats the words aloud, stumbling a little over the formulaic phrasing. Tell the king of Mari, my king sends friendship, my king sends 5 jars of fine oil and asks in return for 20 donkeys. The scribes frown and make him start again, reminding him that every syllable matters. Diplomacy isn't casual, it's bureaucratic theater. Here's the historical fact. Mesopotamian archives preserve actual diplomatic letters, including the famous Amarna letters found in Egypt, which echo earlier traditions from Mesopotamia. Kings communicated with one another in stiff, formulaic language, often demanding gifts, gold, or brides for political marriages. These were not spontaneous negotiations, but carefully managed exchanges tracked by bureaucrats. And the quirky tidbit? Some letters between kings read less like lofty statecraft and more like petty sibling squabbles. One king scolds another for failing to send enough gold, essentially writing, "You call this a gift? It's too small." Another sulks that his envoys weren't treated properly at dinner. Imagine the rulers of mighty city-states whining about bad hospitality recorded forever in clay. Historians still argue whether these diplomatic exchanges truly reflected equal partnerships, or whether they disguised unequal power. Were these letters genuine negotiations, or just rituals where weaker kings groveled to stronger ones? The debate lingers. But the tablets show a surprising amount of micromanagement. Every jar, every bride, every donkey had to be tallied and accounted for. You watch as a marriage alliance is arranged. A princess, veiled and solemn, is escorted toward the caravan. Her dowry is listed on a tablet. Jewelry, clothing, slaves, jars of perfume. The items are loaded carefully, each one checked against the record. The marriage may seal peace between city-states, but in the eyes of the scribes, it's just another transaction with an itemized list. Nearby, another scribe records the gifts sent to a neighboring ruler: exotic woods, fine wool, a crafted lyre. The list is long, and when one item seems missing, panic ripples through the courtyard. Was it forgotten, stolen, or miscounted? The scribes scurry to check, tallying again. Their faces pale with the fear of delivering an incomplete gift. You realize bureaucracy has made even generosity stressful. As the caravan departs, the envoys carry their clay letters sealed in envelopes, stamped with the king's insignia. They ride out under the blazing sun, burdened not just with goods, but with the weight of official records. If they succeed, more tablets will be written praising their diligence. If they fail, more tablets will accuse them of incompetence. Either way, the clay will speak louder than their voices. By nightfall, you sit near the gates, watching torches flicker as the dust settles inside the city. More scribes continue drafting letters, more officials dictate demands, more records pile up. Diplomacy here isn't a handshake or a smile. It's paperwork, tedious, detailed, and permanent. You close your eyes, imagining envoys trudging across deserts, their bags heavy not just with goods but with tablets, each one a fragile brick in the endless wall of international bureaucracy. The desert air hangs heavy tonight, and you find yourself wandering back toward the scribal quarter of the city. The palace is quiet. The temple looms in shadow, but a faint glow spills from a small chamber lined with shelves of clay tablets. You step closer and hear the familiar scratching of styluses. Yet when you peer inside, you realize these scribes aren't recording rations or donkey trades. They're copying stories, epic tales, myths, hymns, words that shimmer with something far beyond barley counts. Even here, in the heart of bureaucracy, imagination has found its ledger. The room is warm, smelling of clay dust and lamp oil. A young scribe leans over a tablet, pressing careful wedges that tell of Gilgamesh, the restless king of Uruk, and his search for immortality. Another scribe recites lines aloud while his companion copies them, syllable by syllable. It's repetitive, meticulous work, not unlike writing receipts, but the content feels larger, almost cosmic. You realize that bureaucracy hasn't just birthed accounting. It has accidentally given birth to literature. Here's the historical fact that anchors you: the Epic of Gilgamesh, often called the world's first great work of literature, survives on clay tablets written in cuneiform. These stories endured for millennia precisely because they were recorded by the same scribal system that tracked grain and beer. Bureaucracy preserved not just laws and taxes, but myths and human longing. And the quirky tidbit: some tablets of the epic contained doodles or notes in the margins, as if the copyist got bored halfway through writing about monsters and floods. One tablet even has corrections, where a later scribe marked error in line. Imagine the world's first literary. Critic and office clerk with a stylus grumbling, "You misquoted the hero again." Historians still argue whether the stories were performed first as oral recitations, only later captured in writing, or whether scribes themselves began composing them for entertainment. Between endless tallies. Either way, you see the irony. Bureaucracy, designed to track livestock and taxes, became the midwife of humanity's imagination. You lean closer as a scribe mutters a line about Enkidu, the wild man, tamed by bread and beer. The words feel strangely familiar echoes of the same bread and beer ration lists you've seen carved 100 times. Myths and administration overlap, like two columns on the same spreadsheet. Perhaps to the Mesopotamian mind, God's heroes and barley were all part of the same record, the grand account of life, nearby. An older scribe explains to an apprentice why copying these stories matters. If they are written, he says softly, they will endure when our voices fade. The boy nods, his stylus trembling, realizing that his work will outlast him. You watch the moment sink in. Bureaucracy offers not just control but immortality daughters. Night deepens. The scribes carefully stack the drying tablets on shelves beside ledgers of taxes and audits. Myth and mirth rest side by side, indistinguishable in clay. You can't help but chuckle at the absurdity. The Epic of Gilgamesh shows its survival. To the same dull system that counted goats. Humanity's oldest epic is, quite literally, paperwork. You step outside, the stars glittering faintly above the city. The hum of the scribes still drifts from the chamber, a lullaby of reeds clicking on clay. You stretch out on a rooftop, eyelids drooping, and realize you've stumbled on a secret. Bureaucracy is not only about power and control, it's also about memory. And in its dusty, tedious way, it saved humanity's stories from vanishing into the desert wind. The city stirs again, and this time your steps lead you not to the bustling market or the lofty palace, but to quieter courtyards where women move between workshops, storerooms, and shrines. The stylus still scratches here too, though the marks capture something often overlooked. Women woven into the bureaucratic web of Mesopotamia. They aren't just shadows in the background. Their names, roles, and responsibilities appear right there on clay tablets. Proof that the machinery of paperwork touched them as much as men. You pause by a doorway where a priestess directs workers. She's wrapped in fine linen, hair oiled, and neatly braided, her seal dangling proudly from her wrist. She checks tallies of offerings brought to the temple, baskets of dates, jars of oil, bolts of wool. A scribe records her approvals, pressing neat wedges into the clay. The priestess nods sharply when a worker fumbles, her authority carved into every line. Here's the historical fact anchoring this. Women in Mesopotamia could hold positions of real power, especially as priestesses. Some managed temple estates, controlled large amounts of land, and oversaw labor forces. Tablets name them directly, showing they weren't invisible in the bureaucratic structure they signed, sealed, and supervised. And the quirky tidbit? Some tablets record business contracts made by women, even involving beer sales. One fragment shows a woman lending out beer on credit, expecting repayment with interest. You grin at the thought of a Mesopotamian tavern keeper slapping her clay. Receipt down saying, "Pay up, you owe me 3 jars and a loaf." Bureaucracy, it seems, didn't care about gender. It cared about numbers. Historians still argue how widespread this authority really was. Were these women exceptions, members of elite families, or did ordinary wives and widows also manage accounts? Evidence suggests both. Elite women dominated temple administration, while others ran households like small offices, tallying supplies and workers. Either way, their presence on tablets proves bureaucracy wasn't solely a male enterprise. You wander into a home where a woman oversees her household accounts. On a clay tablet by the doorway are simple tallies of grain used for bread, wool spun for cloth, and servants' rations. She supervises her children grinding flour, scolds a servant for wasting oil, and checks the day's numbers with a sharp eye. Her husband may be away trading, but she is the household's accountant, keeping chaos at bay with wedge dash marks dot in another alley. You glimpse a group of women weaving in a courtyard. Their work is recorded by scribes as part of larger temple accounts. How many cloths woven? How many hours worked? How many loaves paid as rations? You sense the weight of bureaucracy pressing down, reducing their artistry to numbers. Yet at the same time, those numbers preserve their existence, ensuring their labor is remembered long after their voices fade. One woman pauses to adjust her loom, muttering about her ration of beer being short this week. Another jokes bitterly that the scribes probably drink it themselves. You laugh quietly. It's the same complaint workers made at the temple and palace. Bureaucracy unites everyone, male or female, in shared grumbles about short rations. By dusk, torches flicker in the courtyards, and you see women sealing contracts with cylinder seals, their carved designs rolling across the clay like signatures. The impressions gleam in the lamplight, proof of their authority. You can almost hear the whispers of later generations doubting their importance. Yet the clay says otherwise. You lie down near the weaving courtyard, eyelids heavy, the smell of wool and oil hanging in the air. And as you drift, you think of how bureaucracy gave women an unlikely kind of immortality. Their voices might be lost, but their names, their trades, their tallies, those still survive. Scratched into clay. The night air cools, and when morning comes you wander to a quieter corner of the city where shouts and donkey brays fade into the distance. Here you find a group of children sitting cross-legged on reed mats, clay tablets balanced on their laps. Their brows are furrowed, their fingers sticky with damp mud. This is the Edinburgh the tablet house, the training ground, where the next generation of bureaucrats is shaped. You crouch nearby, realizing you're witnessing the world's first school system, designed not to inspire poets but to produce competent clerks. The room is dim, lit only by oil lamps, and the air smells of clay and sweat. An instructor paces back and forth, reed stylus in hand like a baton. He barks commands: copy this list, solve this sum, repeat the signs until your wrist aches. The children groan but obey, pressing rows of wedges into the clay. The sound is a steady tap, 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 like rain on a roof. Here's the historical fact. Mesopotamian schools trained scribes through rote practice. Archaeologists have uncovered countless practice tablets, filled with repetitive exercises, lists of professions, names of cities, multiplication tables, even model contracts. The goal wasn't creativity, it was accuracy. One mistake in a ration list could mean famine or fraud, so precision was drilled into every pupil. And the quirky tidbit: some tablets showed that students copied the same sentence dozens of times, such as a scribe who does not know Sumerian. What kind of scribe is he? It's basically the world's oldest version of writing lines as punishment. You chuckle, imagining a boy rolling his eyes while etching that phrase for the 50th time. Historians still argue whether all scribes began in these formal schools, or whether some learned privately in families of clerks. Evidence suggests both systems existed. In either case, education was demanding, lasting years, and only a small portion of the population, mostly boys from elite families, had access still. A few tablets name female students, hinting that the path wasn't entirely closed. You watch as the instructor hands out a new exercise, lists of birds, fish, and plants. The students dutifully copy, filling their tablets with endless rows of wedge marks. One boy scratches a doodle of a bird in the corner, earning a sharp rap on the knuckles. Another accidentally smudges his work and sighs dramatically, as if the gods themselves conspired against his handwriting. You smile. School frustration is eternal. In a separate corner, advanced students tackle mathematics. They scratch out multiplication and division problems, calculating amounts of grain, bricks, or beer. One boy mutters under his breath as he struggles with 30 times 12, while another breezes through with smug confidence. The instructor nods approvingly, reminding everyone that numbers matter as much as words. After all, without accurate math, no canal gets dug, no temple gets built, no ration gets distributed. By midday, the children slump with exhaustion. Clay tablets litter the floor, some cracked from careless handling. The instructor collects them, stacking them neatly for review. His expression grim. You can almost hear him muttering, "The gods help me if this is the next generation." Yet he knows these weary students are essential. Without them, the entire machinery of city life collapses. As evening falls, the students are finally dismissed. They shuffle out, carrying their practice tablets like homework, some proud, others frustrated. A few toss broken ones aside, leaving shards scattered in the dust. You pick one up, turning it in your hand. It contains half a multiplication table, abruptly cut off by a crack. The student probably despaired, cursed the clay, and started again centuries later. His unfinished assignment survives. As archaeology. You settle onto a reed mat, eyelids heavy as the classroom grows quiet. The lamps sputter out, leaving only the faint smell of clay dust. And you realize the truth. Bureaucracy wasn't just maintained by scribes. It had to be taught, drilled and rehearsed endlessly. Every tally of barley, every receipt for donkeys, every law carved in stone began here in the patience and boredom of the tablet house. Civilization, in other words, was built on homework. The morning sun glares harshly across the land, and you wander beyond the bustling walls of Uruk into the open plains. The air feels heavier here, as if weighed down by stories of wars, droughts, and kingdoms that rose quickly only to tumble just as fast. And as you trudge along the dry canal beds, you realize something. Bureaucracy may have seemed eternal when scribes scratched their lists in clay, but it wasn't immune to collapse. When cities fell, so did their paperwork, though. Never all at once. You pass abandoned storehouses, their walls crumbling, barley long since eaten by rodents or raiders. In the dust you find broken tablets, fragments of rations owed to workers who never collected them. One lists 20 loaves for canal diggers. Another tallies sheep that probably wandered off centuries ago. They are the receipts of a world that came and done. Here's the historical fact. Mesopotamian city-states often suffered from cycles of collapse, brought on by war, shifting rivers, and climate change. Tablets from places like Ur show sudden breaks in record-keeping, with archives abandoned mid-sentence. Bureaucracy, for all its permanence, faltered when armies invaded or canals dried up. And the quirky tidbit? Archaeologists in some ruins have discovered tablets that were left half-baked. When scribes fled, the marks are there, but the clay never hardened fully. It's as if someone dropped their ledger mid-task, panicked, and ran. The half-finished math problem of a scribe now sits in a museum, an eternal cliffhanger. Did he ever balance that account? You grin sadly. It's the world's first unfinished homework excuse. Historians still argue whether bureaucracy cushioned these collapses or hastened them. Some say careful record-keeping helped cities survive droughts by redistributing food. Others suggest bureaucracy became too rigid, choking flexibility, trapping people in quotas when innovation was needed. Was it lifeline or dead weight? The debate swirls like desert dust. You wander through an abandoned temple. The ziggurat looms, cracked and silent. Inside, shelves of tablets lie toppled, many still intact. You trace your fingers over the names of men and women, long forgotten workers, taxpayers, merchants captured forever in clay even though their city fell centuries ago. Bureaucracy outlived their voices, stubbornly clinging to relevance even as the bricks around it crumbled. But not everything disappeared. In the ruins, you find scribes setting up shop again. New kings rise, new temples demand offerings, new palaces tally rations. The stylus keeps scratching, even if the city changes. Names. Bureaucracy, it seems, is like a stubborn weed. Cut it down, and it sprouts again as long as humans gather in groups. By dusk, you sit on the edge of the canal, the air buzzing with cicadas. In the distance, smoke curls from a village rebuilding itself, where a fresh archive of tablets is already being stacked. Collapse and continuity blend together here. The walls fall, the rulers vanish, but the habit of record-keeping survives, passed like a torch to the next set of weary clerks. You stretch out under the wide Mesopotamian sky, the stars faint behind a veil of dust. Your eyelids droop, and the thought settles softly. Kingdoms may rise and fall, but bureaucracy endures, trudging on through disaster. Not glamorous, not heroic, just persistent. And maybe that's why it survives when so much else fails. The dust of fallen cities still clings to your sandals as you drift eastward in time, watching how Mesopotamian habits refuse to die. Even as one dynasty crumbles, the next eagerly adopts the old systems, polishing them into sharper tools. You find yourself in the court of the Persian Empire. Centuries later, where scrolls and tablets stack high on wooden shelves, couriers gallop across vast roads, bringing orders written in the same spirit that once managed barley and donkeys in Uruk. Bureaucracy, born in muddy villages, now stretches across continents. Here's the historical fact. Mesopotamian methods of record-keeping influenced later empires profoundly. The Persians inherited the idea of detailed taxation, standardized weights, and archives of decrees. The Greeks admired Mesopotamian astronomy and numerical systems, which were originally nurtured in temple bureaucracies. The Romans perfected legal codes, but the seed of law carved in stone steles was Mesopotamian. In each empire's dusty records, you can still hear the echo of reeds scratching clay. And the quirky tidbit? The Persians developed the royal road, with mounted couriers carrying dispatches swiftly across their empire. Herodotus quipped that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night stopped them, a phrase later recycled by modern postal services. You can grin at the thought. Every time a mail carrier trudges up your driveway, you're seeing Mesopotamian bureaucracy's great-grandchild still at work. Historians still argue whether these later bureaucracies were direct inheritances or independent inventions. Did Rome really copy Mesopotamia, or did both simply stumble onto the same logic of write it down, make it official? The debate hums on, but the parallels are undeniable. Wherever people gather in large numbers, bureaucracy sprouts like reeds on a riverbank. You wander through an Achaemenid office where scribes dip reeds into ink now, not just clay. Scrolls unroll across tables, contracts listing shipments of grain, tallies of horses, lists of tribute from faraway lands. It feels slicker, faster, but the bones are familiar. The impulse to record, to count, to stamp and seal hasn't changed. Since the first farmer grumbled about missing barley, farther west in Greece, philosophers mutter about justice, but city officials still keep records of taxes, court cases, and citizen rolls. Even the lofty democracy of Athens runs on ledgers, proving that bureaucracy thrives not just in monarchies but anywhere humans need order. You picture a Greek citizen ranting about unfair paperwork, and you laugh. It's the same tune sung by Mesopotamian merchants. And in Rome, bureaucracy blossoms like ivy. Tax records, census rolls, law codes etched on bronze, each a descendant of clay tablets left drying in Mesopotamian courtyards. The Romans even institutionalized the census, counting citizens with the same zeal temple scribes once counted sheep. Bureaucracy became the very definition of civilization. To be counted was to belong. By dusk, you sit on a low stone wall, the air smelling faintly of parchment and dust. Brown you? Empires rise and sprawl, but you see them all linked by the same invisible thread, the quiet persistence of bureaucrats. From reeds in clay to ink on scrolls, the tools may change, but the impulse endures. Kings roar, armies clash, cities burn, but the scribes always remain scratching, stamping, filing. Ensuring that memory outlives chaos, you close your eyes, listening to the hum of riders' hooves on the Persian road, the shuffle of scrolls in Roman offices, the mutter of Greek clerks counting taxes. It's a lullaby of continuity, carrying Mesopotamia's legacy far beyond its rivers. And you realize with a sleepy smile, every time you open your mailbox, every time you groan about taxes, you're still living under the shadow of those first bureaucrats who once tallied goats under the Mesopotamian sun. The air is softer now, as though the long march through dusty archives and noisy markets is finally winding down. You wander one last time through the ruins of Mesopotamia, stepping over broken bricks and shards of tablets, and your mind drifts to today. You look around at the everyday mess of modern life: mailboxes stuffed with bills, tax forms glaring from envelopes, office workers hunched over spreadsheets, and you realize the line is unbroken. Those first clay scratches didn't just belong to ancient kings, they belong to you too. You picture the farmer in Uruk, arguing about sacks of barley, and it feels oddly familiar. Isn't that the same as you squabbling with your utility company about an overcharge? You imagine the scribe, carefully recording donkey receipts, and you laugh it's the ancestor of the car title tucked in your glove compartment, and those complaint tablets where angry merchants ranted about bad copper. They're just prehistoric Yelp reviews. The continuity is absurd and yet comforting. Humans have always groaned under paperwork, and humans have always found petty joy in writing complaints into permanence. Here's the historical fact that ties it all together. The world's first bureaucrats in Mesopotamia set the template for everything that followed: taxation systems, written law, ration lists, and standardized contracts. Without them, no empires could have endured, no states could have managed their people, and no memory could have survived beyond a single lifetime. And a quirky tidbit: one clay tablet from nearly 4,000 years ago records nothing but a shopping list of items for a household. Bread, oil, wool, beer, all tallied in neat rows. You grin at the thought of someone's ancient to-do list ending up in a museum case, admired by scholars as a monument of civilization. Meanwhile, your grocery list probably sits forgotten in your pocket. Bureaucracy, it seems, gives immortality to the mundane. Historians still argue whether bureaucracy liberated or trapped humanity. Did it protect people by creating fairness and memory, or did it shackle them with rules and quotas? The truth, like always, is both. Bureaucracy is the great paradox. It is boring yet powerful, tedious yet essential, invisible yet everywhere. The stars shimmer above you as you lean against a crumbling wall. You think of the scribes bent over their clay tablets, the priests tallying jars of beer, the kings stamping decrees, the women weaving and counting wool, the students groaning through multiplication tables. Each of them is long gone, but there, where shaped marks remain, whispering across 5,000 years, I was here. I counted this. I mattered enough to be written down. And you, lying there in the quiet, realize something soothing. For all our complaints about red tape, about taxes, about forms that never end, bureaucracy is also the reason we have memory, order, and stories at all. It's what stitched fragile human lives into something larger, something that could endure floods, wars, and time itself. Your eyelids grow heavy. The flicker of torchlight in your imagination softens into the glow of a modern desk lamp, the scratch of reed pens fading into the clack of computer keys. The bureaucrats of Mesopotamia lean back from their clay tablets, their tired sighs mixing with your own, and across the ages, you share the same lull, the knowledge that paperwork will outlive you, but in that, so will your story. Now the rhythm slows, softer, longer, like a river easing into its delta. You've wandered through dusty storehouses and crowded courtyards, listened to scribes muttering over their tablets, and smiled at merchants grumbling about donkeys and beer. All of that busyness, all of that clay and counting, begins to fade. Now, like distant voices muffled by sleep, you picture the wide Mesopotamian sky stretching above you, its stars ancient and steady. The heat of the day is gone. The air is cooler, carrying the faint scent of reeds and water. In the hush, the details of bureaucracy dissolve. No more tablets, no more tokens, no more audits. Just the steady flow of time, carrying those records. Like little clay boats down a quiet river, your breathing slows. You imagine lying on the soft earth by the banks of the Euphrates. The ground is warm beneath you, and the faint hum of crickets fills the night. Somewhere far away, you hear the splash of water against reeds, the frantic energy of the day, the shouts of markets, the tapping of styluses. The complaints of farmers melts into silence. And as you sink deeper, you realize there's a strange comfort in bureaucracy's persistence. Those scribes, long gone, were just people trying to make sense of their world. They counted grain so no one would starve. They wrote laws so arguments wouldn't turn to bloodshed. They carved myths so memory could outlast forgetting. They weren't glamorous. They weren't heroes, but their steady, patient work gave us the possibility of order, of continuity, of civilization itself. Let that thought rest gently on you, the idea that even the most tedious tasks, the tallies, The receipts, the careful lines of writing were acts of care in their own way. Small efforts, multiplied across centuries, became the foundations of everything we know. And you, too, are part of that long chain of people writing, recording, and remembering. The night deepens. The stars will slowly overhead. The scribes' whispers fade into a lullaby, a rhythm of clay and silence. You let go of the numbers, the lists, the endless red tape. None of it matters here in this moment. What matters is the quiet, the softness, the way time stretches out like a calm river. Your body grows heavier, more relaxed. Each breath sinks you deeper into the stillness. The Mesopotamian night closes around you, safe and steady as the clay. Tablets crumble into dust. All that remains is the hush of reeds, the sparkle of distant stars, and the certainty that you are part of a story that stretches back thousands of years. Rest now. Drift. Sleep. The bureaucrats of old have finished their work, and so have you.